In the year 413 AD, an African bishop by the name of Augustine wrote one of the most important works in the history of the church called The City of God. The event that occasioned the writing of this work was the sacking of Rome, which occurred just a few years previously in 410. Augustine wrote to offer a defense of Christianity to the pagan world, as well as to comfort Christians who thought that the fall of Rome meant that the world was coming to an end, because they had too closely associated the city of Rome with the city of God. But in this massive work, Augustine did something else. What he did was he created for the church a distinctly biblical philosophy of history and society. In this work, the city of God is contrasted to the city of the world. The city of God is made up of God's elect, and the city of the world of unbelievers. The purpose of history, then, is for God to build his city and to populate it with those whom he has called to himself. This, Augustine says, is what is going on in history, and therefore, whether Rome falls or whether Rome stands, God's plan is moving forward. Rome is not God's kingdom. In our passage today, the psalmist is doing something similar by drawing contrasts between two cities. First, notice that the psalmist does not use the first-person pronouns in reference to himself. All throughout verse 1, you can even see it's we, us, our, where he does use first-person singular or second-person singular pronoun her and she. In verse 5, it's referring to a collective body, the church. The psalm begins in verse 1 with a bold statement of faith, from which everything else follows. It says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble, therefore we will not fear. Notice then the contrast between the city of God and that of the world here, beginning in verse 3. In verse 3, there are roaring and troubled waters, but in verse 4, there's a river whose streams shall make glad the people of God. In verse 5, God dwells in the middle of the city, and that city is immovable. While outside, in verse 6, the nations rage and kingdoms move, and what is God's response to them? He speaks, and they melt away. Calvin said of verse 5, if we desire to be protected by the hand of God, we must be concerned above all things that he may dwell among us. In verse 8, then, we come to the invitation. The psalmist says, come, behold the works of the Lord. Another word that could maybe be used here is consider. And there are other times in the Bible we are told to stop and to think and to consider. Think of Romans 11:22, which says, consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God. Also Hebrews 12:3, consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Here we're told to consider the power of God's wrath in verse 8. He has made desolations of the earth. And the peace that Christ brings in verse 9. The psalmist is speaking of the Messiah here. This is a messianic psalm. And this verse 9, should remind us of some other passages in Scriptures, particularly Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. Familiar passage. A child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. And there will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. In Luke 2:14 also, when the angels announced the birth of Christ to the shepherds, what do they say? Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests. The psalmist says, consider this. Behold the works of the Lord. Finally, in verse 10, it says, be still and know that I am God. God is building his city. And this is not merely a spiritual city, but is a physical, tangible reality. It does not exist in another world or only in our own minds. Rather, he says, I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. When we read and sing this passage in a few moments about God being our refuge, we're not just repeating some platitude or a cliche to make ourselves feel better. These are not just happy thoughts we plant into our minds. Rather, we are affirming our confidence in God's promises. We are identifying ourselves as citizens in this great city that he is building in history, and we are pledging allegiance to Christ as our King.